Welcome to Advisory Opinions. I was going to say I'm David French. That's weird. I haven't done that before.
It's so weird. I was anticipating that coming out of your mouth. I don't
Isn't
know
that
why.
strange?
It's so strange. Okay.
I'm not David French. I remain and forever shall not be David French. I'm Sarah Isger. That's David French. And as part of our August book series of books that are, in the law genre, we're going to talk to A.J. Jacobs about the year of living constitutionally, where he literally lives according to the words in the Constitution, though it never says you have to write with a quill or sign, the bill at a restaurant with a quill, David. And yet.
No, this is a fun interview. I promise folks will enjoy this.
But before we get to that, we got something from the Supreme Court, which was, David, was it a surprise for you?
It was a surprise for me. It was a big surprise for me. A lot of people talked about this as a 5-4 decision, but it was 9-0 on the core and 5-4 on the periphery. And so what this was an appeal to the Supreme Court, application for stay, challenging injunction handed down in lower court against the new Title IX rules that the Biden administration has promulgated. And the main beef was with rules that deal with rights to bodily privacy and safety, definition of hostile environment, harassment, extension of Title IX to cover gender identity in addition to sex. And what was really interesting about this was the following sentence, Sarah. It was, importantly, all members of the court today accept that the plaintiffs were entitled to preliminary injunctive relief as to the 3 provisions of the rule, including the central provision that newly defines sex discrimination to include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. That surprised me, Sarah. Did that surprise you?
Everything about this had little surprises built into it.
Yes, it
Not
did,
earth-shattering surprises, but little ones. So that paragraph had some little surprises. Importantly, all members of the court today accept that the plaintiffs were entitled to preliminary injunctive relief as to the 3 provisions of the rule, including the central provision that newly defines sex discrimination to include discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And I guess I honestly was expecting while I read this that, the majority's saying that. Let's see if the dissent agrees that that's what they've done. And then they do. There actually is 9-0 agreement on that point. It's not just the majority characterizing the dissent, beyond what they would agree to. So that was a little nugget locked in there. Also, the 5-4 aspect of it. So it was Sotomayor, Kagan, and Jackson in dissent with Gorsuch. Now, first blush, that's a little, surprise nugget. Of course, though, Justice Gorsuch is the author of Bostock, which did expand or recalibrate the definition of sex in Title VII employment discrimination lawsuits, that in fact lawsuits dealing with gender identity discrimination and sexual orientation discrimination are encompassed in the term sex, because those types of discrimination are about sex, basically.
Right.
But that, David, so then you're like, oh, well, maybe it's not a surprise that Gorsuch is in the dissent, except that they agree, all 9, that this did overstep Title IX's definition of sex. So then you go back to it being a surprise, and actually probably more about Justice Gorsuch's views on these over-inclusive injunctive relief from circuit courts. In this case, it's the 6th and 5th Circuit, I believe, that had the injunctions that made it all the way up. And I will say, David, that, and I have not read all of the Title IX regulations that are at issue here, so I am going with the dissent's description of the other regulations that are therefore enjoined, whereas the dissent would sever the parts that are, in the injunction from these other parts that were not relative to the injunction. So those provisions include, I'll just read one, a provision requiring access to lactation spaces and reasonable modification for pregnant students, such as restroom breaks. Yeah, I kind of agree that the plaintiffs in this case did not allege any harm from having lactation rooms, and therefore it's unclear to me why any injunctive relief would reach that. Now, the majority says it's just not obvious how to sever all of the other provisions and or difficult for sort of a temporary implementation of all these other regulations when these schools won't know what the sort of end will be on the merits section. And so it's just easier to enjoin them all. I'm actually pretty sympathetic to that argument. The Sixth Circuit, I guess, is hearing oral argument in, I believe it was October. So we'll have some resolution. This will go back up to the Supreme Court on the merits in pretty short order. So like the status quo in this case perhaps favors simply not forcing schools to implement these changes until we know how they all interact with each other and can sort of do this more globally. That being said, if you're someone who thinks that these injunctions are getting too broad, both in national effect and in what all they put on hold, especially from governments not being able then to do things for years on end until then there's a new president and they withdraw the whole thing and like, what are we doing here? The lactation room thing kind of hit me.
Yeah, when I say I was surprised by the outcome, I'm not surprised that the regulation was enjoined, or at least part of the regulation was enjoined. I'm very surprised that the 3 elements were enjoined 9-0. That's what surprises me. I'm a little bit surprised that there wasn't any real effort by the 5-justice majority at severability. That just sort of hand waved and said these things are all just kind of linked together with the rest of the regulation. But as you pointed out, Sarah, some elements of their new regulation don't really seem to have that much connection at all to the 3 challenge provisions.
But I sort of get it. Like, think of it like a spectrum, right? Yeah, the lactation room thing obviously is easy to separate and severable. And then there's going to be some things that like don't seem like they're connected, but maybe are a little harder to sever. And it's like, where do you draw the line?
Yeah.
Do you really want to spend all the time right now to dive into severability when this is in a preliminary posture and the merits is coming back soon enough? So I get the majority's point, actually. But this is the problem with emergency docket stuff, because the lactation room thing obviously could go into effect.
That absolutely. But I'm completely with you. I understand the argument against severability. I absolutely understand it. There are elements, though, that do seem severable if you actually kind of press pause and do this in a deliberate fashion. But I do think the thing to hear, if you look at this case and the bump stock case together with Loper Bright hovering in the background as well, this is the case that overturned Chevron. I think a consistent theme here would be statutes aren't that malleable anymore. In other words, what we've had is a situation where if you have a Title IX and you have a Democratic president, Title IX means one thing. And then you have the same statute exactly. The statute has not been amended at all. Not one syllable of it is amended. Not one punctuation mark, nothing amended. And then a new president comes in and Title IX means something different. And then the next president, and so from Obama to Trump to back to Biden, it's a seesaw with the statute not changing at all. And that is the issue that I just find that it's just not acceptable. That's not, this is when you get to Gorsuch. In Gorsuch's book, he talks about the difference between rule of laws and rule of law. And sometimes the rule of laws can be unjust. Rule of law implies there's a hidden sort of justice component implied in the phrase rule of law. But here what you have is just this seesaw back and forth without a change in the underlying statute. And that is a real problem. And it's indicative of the, guess what? We're going to talk about this a little bit in the book, Year of Living Constitutionally, in the conversation we're just about to have about, what is it you say you do here, Congress? If the statute is going to fundamentally change, shouldn't the statute change? And so I think that there's an element of that going on as well.
Yeah, I mean, this was a lot of the beef with Bostock. Once you've got to push past the sort of hysterics on all sides about the political culture war aspect. But a real beef is what Congress intended to do with Title VII. They're very aware of changing cultural norms around sexual orientation and gender identity. They can amend Title VII anytime they want. So is congressional inaction here a sign that they wanted to leave those things out of Title VII? Or is the fact that Bostock was from 2018 and it's been 6 years and Congress hasn't acted to not include sexual orientation, for instance, in Title VII mean congressional acquiescence that Bostock was right? I hate both of those sets of arguments that, like, we're supposed to read tea leaves when Congress doesn't do something for one side or the other. But I think, David, this also looks a lot like the Clean Power Plan regulations, where Obama had one Clean Power Plan. Trump has rescinds that different one. Biden rescinds that. He doesn't just put in place the Obama one. He has a different one.
Yeah.
So I think you could have a situation where, if Harris, for instance, were to win the presidency, you still would rescind these Title IX regulations and put in place the Harris Title IX regulations. And remember that these are real people trying to implement this. They have to talk to their lawyers and come up with a whole implementation plan. In fact, I believe some of these regulations require the schools to come up with an implementation plan. The amount of money and time that takes is real. And the thing I like to point out about all of this stuff that I don't point out enough, money and time are trade-offs. So the money and time you spend on this and then redoing it when there's a new set of regulations and redoing that when there's another injunction or whatever is time you're not spending on, can my students read? Or is this money that could go to scholarships or any number of other things? I'm using sort of the most extreme examples, but I got into this conversation the other day, David, about the arguments over renaming schools. And Concord Middle School, which is named Concord Middle School, there's a move to rename it after a wonderfully impressive person who I'd never heard of, who had gone to Concord Public Schools, a Black woman who was incredible, just heroic story all around. And perhaps they should name the school after her. To be clear, I don't really care. I think that overall, the renaming stuff has, gotten overboard in some cases. It is exclusionary to some people. It's exclusionary the way it currently is to some people. But my larger point, and this, by the way, also coming from me, who desperately wanted to rename Jefferson Davis Highway next to my house. It has since been renamed, thank God. So, obviously, I'm not against renaming at all times. But it's a trade-off. So let's look at the Concord Public School, success with their students. And then let's look at how much time the school board has spent on this renaming debate and ask ourselves whether that's a good use of time. And the students that they're trying to help, perhaps, even with the renaming, might be more helped if we spent more time on the stuff that's hard, actually. I know why they want to spend time on the renaming debate, because that's something everyone can have an opinion on. It's a lot harder to say, why aren't some of our children reading at grade level, proficient at math at grade level? And so we spend our time debating school renamings. And that, to me, is part of a lot of our debates right now. It's a trade-off. Are we spending our time on the right things? Our lawyer time, our time, the money, all of it. And that's what regulations are, David. They're money and time.
Well, and compounding all of that. But, oh, by the way, when you talk about the renaming, it reminds me of what actually made so many parents in San Francisco go volcanic.
Yes.
Was, remember when the San Francisco Unified School District during the pandemic era was spending an awful lot of time about renaming and murals and all of this stuff, and they didn't have a reopening plan.
Yep.
And so, you have all of these millions upon millions of students going back to school in carefully planned re-entry programs, and you've got all these San Francisco parents, and not only had the schools not open, they were having trouble finding if there was even a plan to have the schools open. But by golly, they're renaming, and there were electoral consequences there. Absolutely, electoral consequences. But
you raised it's about the trade-off.
You raised something really interesting, Sarah, that goes to sort of the heart of our culture war, and that is it's quite possible that one reason why culture war issues predominate in our politics over policy, and I know that there are connections between culture war and policy. Don't jump down my throat about that. But as far as like economic policy, we spend a ton more time talking about, say, trans athletes than we do spend talking about economic policy, foreign policy, et cetera. And I think one of the reasons is a lot of the culture war stuff, everyone can have an opinion on it.
Yep.
And everyone's opinion in some ways feels equally valid or whatever, because they're rooting it in sort of first principles. This is what I believe marriage is. This is what I believe, the rights of the church are. This is what I believe is a man or a woman. This is what, and so you're dealing with issues that really universally resonate, where people sort of universally feel like they've got a thought about it. And whereas if you say, look, Trump's tariffs are going to be inflationary, or Harris's price controls can lead to shortages, that's just going 10 miles over most people's heads. They don't know the answer. And so when Trump says, no, it's not a tax on Americans, it's a tax on China, even though that's not actually quite true, it's just too much for people to dive into. And so you end up with this situation where it's culture war all the time, because that's what people get.
I also think there's a little bit of the, it's funny, as so many other industries move into further and further expertise, journalism has not. And so as you hire younger journalists with less experience who are cheaper and will work long hours and stuff like that, they're a lot more qualified to write about culture war topics than they are to write about FEC filings, economic policy, because, budget negotiations on the Hill. Now, in fairness, it's because there hasn't been a real budget on the Hill in a long time. But if you don't have the expertise, it's really hard to start writing that first article. But everyone can have an opinion on culture war stuff. It's easy to find people to quote on culture war stuff. And so, it's odd as we move into over expertise in, I think, a lot of areas, and over specialization. Media and politics has moved away from that.
It's almost like complexity is making us dumber.
Yeah.
That essentially what's happening is we're looking at, let's just take, for example, hey guys, how do we deal with and ameliorate the effects of 40 to 50 years of terrible zoning and discriminatory zoning rules that resulted in high degrees of inequality in the city, combined with a lack of livability, and that has perpetuated pre-existing racial injustice? Like, how do we deal with that? I don't know. Like, I don't know. And so it's easy to sort of retreat back to sloganeering or whatever. And you get this
the equivalent
also
in education is, 50 years ago, it was much easier to say, what should we do about the legacy of racial discrimination and segregation in schools? Oh, well, we need to pay teachers more, put more money into these schools, et cetera, et cetera. So now we have 50 years of doing that. And it hasn't worked.
It hasn't worked.
So now what do you want to do? And everyone's like, let's rename the school.
Exactly. Let's rename it. Bingo. Yeah, exactly.
So it's easy to have ideas for what to fix, but what happens if you've tried a lot of those ideas and they haven't solved the problem, and you start running out of the ideas, and it's like, well, I don't have a lot of new ones. Or like universal basic income. Like, oh, welfare hasn't worked. Well, what if we just try giving people money? Like, okay, no, well, now we have the academics on studies on that. Universal basic income, the idea of, instead of sort of you get, money for this specific thing, or you could go to this place to receive a credit for this. And it gets so complicated. It has huge transactional costs that aren't going to the people who need the money, but rather to the people who administer the system. So what if we just give the people who need the money a check? Sounds like an awesome idea. Conservatives like the idea. Nope. Also doesn't work. And it turns out those people go more into debt than the control group that did not get the universal basic income money. And so you're like, oh no, how do we solve poverty? Let's talk about how we need to take down these statutes.
Yeah. And you're seeing a version of this play out in the pro-life world, because for years and years and years and years, you had 50 years of, okay, we have a We have a primary policy goal, and that is the reversal of Roe. And then, we've talked a lot about this. There's then the what next? What next? And then you begin to realize, okay, wait, we're in this unbelievably negative political environment for the pro-life cause. What do you do about that? How do you change that? How do you, once you realize that, wait a minute, reversing Roe didn't actually end up decreasing abortions. What now? And there's just an enormous amount of complexity and confusion around the what now. And you almost feel like there's this longing for the simplicity of, well, we got to get rid of Roe, which similarly, you get rid of school segregation in Brown. And then there's a giant what now, because that doesn't reset everything. It doesn't make everything equal. It just gives you an opportunity to start to change things. And that change becomes incredibly, incredibly difficult. So, yeah, the complexity of our issues, I think, is ironically enough driving the stupidity of our politics.
All right, last thing, circuit decision out of the Ninth Circuit, finding ineffective assistance of counsel. Rare that someone wins that kind of claim, that their lawyer screwed up so badly it was not reasonable. In this case, the lawyer failed to challenge the police entrance onto the property as a Fourth Amendment violation. And there's just this delightful concurrence from Judge Bumate of the Ninth Circuit, because, David, it uses my favorite word, maybe my favorite word in all of law. So I'm just going to read a portion here. Few things are more serious than an overstep of government power, and here we have a literal one. When law enforcement officers enter the property adjoining the defendant's home at night, jump the neighbor's side retaining wall, cross the defendant's front yard along a partially fenced-off front porch, and arrive just 1 foot away from the open garage door of the defendant's private home, all without a warrant, they crossed a line. And that line was real. The Fourth Amendment safeguards the people from unreasonable government searches. Absent some well-delineated exceptions, it requires searches to be supported by a warrant and probable cause. The government officers may not intrude on the sanctity of the home, either by physically trespassing or by invading the owner's reasonable expectation of privacy, is central to the Fourth Amendment. That protection isn't limited to the four corners of the home. It can also extend to the areas immediately surrounding the home, known as the curtilage. Oh, David, I love the word curtilage. It is fun. It is evocative. It sounds like an onomatopoeia. I don't know why. Heightened protections for curtilage is long-standing and predates even the founding of this country, tracing its roots to English common law. The Los Angeles Sheriff's Department's deputies violated Harsin Chong's Fourth Amendment rights when they entered the curtilage of his home without a warrant or an exigency. Thus, Chong's counsel was ineffective for failing to bring a motion to suppress based on a common law trespass theory of the Fourth Amendment right. As the per curiam opinion establishes, a common law trespass challenge was a clearly winning argument under modern precedent. Even so, the government counters that the common law trespass threat of the Fourth Amendment is a relatively new phenomenon, and so it was excusable for Chong's counsel to miss it. But that's wrong. As set forth below, protections against trespassing on curtilage is deeply rooted in our nation's history, so it should have been obvious even before more recent Supreme Court cases articulation of the Fourth Amendment right. He goes on to talk about the text, history, and tradition of curtilage, and it uses the word curtilage many times. In fact, 106 times you get the word curtilage in this overall opinion. And David, that to me is a treat. Also, Judge Bumate is just one of those great judicial writers, so I always like to highlight some of his extra stuff. Don't challenge him on the history of curtilage. Don't tell him that's new. And David, interestingly, and this goes to the writing point, but that's wrong. He used a contraction there, and I think that's interesting in writing and a bit controversial. That,
yeah,
apostrophe S, not, but that is wrong. So I don't know what you think about contractions in professional writing.
I've generally avoided them, but then they come so naturally that it's hard to consistently purge them from your writing. But my general, to the extent that I even think about it, it is a negative. But
and what do you think about the word curtilage?
I'm a big fan of the word curtilage. In fact, it needs to be, there's a rise in creativity in baby names.
Curt.
Yeah.
It's a
Curt.
Yeah.
Short for curtilage. Yeah.
What's that short for? Curtilage.
You need to see, somebody needs to go first. Somebody needs to go first with curtilage, and then it will be all the rage.
Also interesting, David, that in this sentence, heightened protection for curtilage, not for the curtilage. It doesn't take an article. I don't think I really thought that through a lot. But with that, David, speaking of old-timey words that we don't use a lot, let's talk to A.J. Jacobs, our author for this episode, and his book, The Year of Living Constitutionally. Well, David, that was fun.
That was fun. I'm absolutely a sucker for a story where somebody just dives in, man, and just owns it. And that the letters of Mark and the quartering of the soldier are just, that's just special stuff right there. And the idea that I had a ski boat, I don't know why, I just can't stop laughing about it. But really enjoyed that, Sarah.
I look forward to seeing y'all on the ski boat someday, taking down our country's enemies.
My wig flowing, because I'm going to get a long wig, Sarah, flowing. Yeah,
beautiful.
Absolutely.
It's nice because the white wig will actually match your beard now.
True. Absolutely.
It'll all be of one. Yeah, that's good.
Yes.
So next up, we have David Latt, the return of Latt, on Advisory Opinions to talk about his book. He wrote a fiction book about the Supreme Court, and I don't know, he teases that he's working on another one, so I thought we could get into fiction legal writing, which is fun.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. Love fiction legal writing, and so that'll be fun. And David Latt is, of course, mutually one of our favorite people on the planet, so it's always great to have him back.
Next time on Advisory Opinions, A.J. Jacobs, author of The Year of Living Constitutionally. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, David. Delighted to be here.
We need to back up, right? Because in 2007, you actually published a book called The Year of Living Biblically, One Man's Humble Quest to Follow the Bible as Literally as Possible. And I will tell you, when this book was recommended to me, I was kind of snotty about it and was like, this doesn't sound like my type of book. Because to me, I assumed, judging a book by its cover, as everyone tells you to do, that it was like going to be a snarky take on originalism or the Bible, right? Sort of proving that you don't need to take this stuff seriously, because if you do take it seriously, there's absurd, hilarious consequences. So I picked up the book in a very negative frame of mind, and that's not what it is at all. And so I'm curious how you came up with this idea way back to live biblically. And then some 15 years later, you know what? Let's do this again when my kids are teenagers so they can really feel how cool their dad is, wearing leggings and writing with a quill pen.
Exactly. That was the motivation, that they would be so proud of me. Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words and for giving me a shot, despite the initial skepticism. And I do try to be, I do try to be both absurd and deeply serious. So I would argue that in some senses this is an absurd undertaking, but I do want to explore the nuances, and it's not a hatchet job. And the religion one came about because I grew up with no religion at all, very secular. I say in the book, I'm Jewish, but I'm Jewish in the same way the Olive Garden is Italian. So not very. No offense to the Olive Garden. But I had a son, and I wanted to know what to teach him about our heritage, religion, the Bible. So, and as a writer, I like to go method. I like to just dive in. So I thought one way to learn about the Bible would be to follow it as literally as possible and see how it changed my life and what works for me and what doesn't. And so I did. I followed the famous ones, the 10 Commandments, but I also followed the hundreds of more obscure rules in the Old Testament, such as not wearing clothes made of 2 different kinds of fabrics, stoning adulterers. I did use very small stones like pebbles, so no one got too hurt. But it was a fascinating year, and
wait, that bears a little bit of a story. Like, you don't just glide over, I stoned an adulterer, but not fatally. Like, that isn't something that you just Passover,
yada, yada.
yeah, blah, blah, day ending in Y, so you have to just pause for a moment there. Like,
I will give
who
you
confessed? Like, what are this is the circumstances?
Absolutely. Yes. I'll give you the short story, which is I live in New York City. And as part of these projects, I like to commit. I wear the clothes because I think clothes actually affect your mind. So I had my robe, I had my huge beard, I had my sandals, and I was in Central Park. And a man came up to me and said, "What's going on?" And I said, "I'm trying to follow the Bible, everything in it from the 10 Commandments to stoning adulterers." He says, "Well, I'm an adulterer. Are you going to stone me?" And I said, "That would be wonderful. What a lovely offer." And I had been carrying around stones for weeks, hoping to run into a self-professed adulterer. And they were very small, as I mentioned, pebble size. And I showed them to him. I had a handful. He was very aggressive. He grabbed the stones out of my hand and threw them at my face. And I thought, an eye for an eye, also mentioned in the Bible. And so that's how I threw one at him. He stormed off. But I checked it off my list, and I felt good about that. At the end of the year, I did get rid of my beard, as you can see, and I got rid of the stones, but it did have a big impact on my life in terms of gratitude and forgiveness and the beauty of rituals and all of these things. So it was a mixed bag. I don't recommend stoning adulterers, but I do recommend gratitude, for instance.
So 15 years later, you're like, let's do this again.
Well, I'd always thought there could be a semi-sequel with the Constitution because some of the same issues are debated in interpreting the Bible and the Constitution. How literally should we take it? How much do the words evolve in meaning? How much should we try to get to the original meaning? So I always thought so. And then a couple of years ago, it became much more timely, in my opinion, because we had 5 of the 9 justices who adhere to some sort of originalism. They have their varieties and flavors, but some sort of originalism. And as you know better than me, originalism means that they think that the most important aspect in interpreting the Constitution is what did the words mean and what was the original public meaning at ratification. So I thought, let me try it again. Let me see if I can go in and try to get into the mindset of the founders and see what was that original meaning by walking the walk and talking the talk and burying my 18th century musket around New York City and writing with a quill pen, writing pamphlets instead of going on Twitter. And so it was a crazy, fascinating year.
So totally endorse pamphleteering instead of Twitter. Totally endorse that. That really needs to catch on. But the other thing, though, you've got to stop again. You don't just walk past. I walked through Manhattan with a musket because, sir, there are gun laws in Manhattan. And how, just explain that little vignette.
Absolutely. Well, I knew I wanted to express my Second Amendment rights in the 1789 or 91 way. So I went on ye old internet and I got an 18th century musket and from a shop in Texas, and they shipped it to me. And it's actually a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, and it's heavy. It's like 11 pounds. And I thought, all right, well, let me do my Second Amendment right. And it's a little bit of a gray area whether I can bear it in New York because some of my advisors said it's an antique and I won't get arrested. So there was it was nervous making. I put on my tricorn to make it clear, like I'm in this, like I'm doing a bit. I'm not trying to. And it did come in handy one time, which was I arrived at a coffee shop at the same time as another customer, and he said, "You go first. I am not arguing with this guy with an 18th century musket." So other people were not as excited to see it, but so it was a mixed bag.
I will say you probably were not threatening, given that you would have had to, if something was happening, you've had to immediately say, "Hold on, I've got to load this thing."
Exactly right. And I did go out and shoot it. I joined some Revolutionary War reenactors, and we went to a gun range, and it was so interesting to see how different this machine was than modern guns, because it takes so many steps to load. 15, you pour in the gunpowder, take out the ramrod, put in the ramrod, put it back. And so it's almost like building a desk from IKEA. It is not just you point and shoot. And that led to a discussion of when is the technology so different that different rules should apply. And it's a complicated topic. And thank you, Sarah, for acknowledging that I didn't try to make it easy, but I tried to present both sides.
So we have a lot of, and by a lot, it's a little hard to estimate, but enough that different ones seem to email me on a regular basis of junior high and high school listeners. And I think this would be a really fun book for them. Not that it's written for that level, it's not. So they will, just to be clear, parents, be reading an adult book. But I remember when I was in high school, someone handed me, and I'm forgetting the name, and it's at my parents' house, but it's something to the effect of like, everything you've been told about American history that's wrong.
Yeah, I love that book. I know that.
And I love that book because it really made you feel smarter than the teacher, which was a core personality character trait of mine, needing to believe that. This is not going to make your child as horribly obnoxious as I was, but maybe like a little obnoxious in a fun way, because I think it introduces constitutional principles and debates in a more fun way than, frankly, we do. So if your child listens to this podcast, they already have gone past the fun part. And this is maybe a return. Like, for instance, favorite chapter title, a complete listing of all arguments for and against originalism that everyone will agree is absolutely definitive and error-free.
So true.
That so promises far, so a lot.
You talk to a lot of constitutional scholars in this book. This is not just AJ Jacobs, like, read the Constitution one time and like has thoughts. A lot of the people you talk to have been on this podcast. Akil Amar is obviously a fun example. And you even talk about his brother. And how'd you go about starting this? You like read the Constitution one day and then you're like, I'm going to need some help with this.
Oh, yes. With the Bible book, I had a board of spiritual advisors. So I had rabbis and ministers and priests and scholars, and I knew I had to do the same thing. So I had scholars from all over the political spectrum. So I had, the most liberal people who thought, oh, it's just Play-Doh and we can make the Constitution mean whatever we want, almost postmodern, to people who were so originalist, they will not capitalize the S in Supreme Court, which I love, because in the Constitution, it's a lowercase s. So let's not give them the credit of giving an uppercase s. And by the way, I thank you for saying that about kids reading it. I think it is, there's one F-bomb, because I talk about the First Amendment, and at the start of our country, there were state laws against blasphemy, against cursing. In New York State at our founding, it was 37.5 cents every time you said the S word or F word or damn. Damn was worst of all. And I tried to institute that in my house because I have teenage sons, and that did not go over well.
I was going to say, none of our 14-year-old listeners have ever heard those words, as any virtuous 14-year-old would not have. So
they don't even know what the words are that you're referring to. Now we're going to have email questions that we're going to have to deal with. So thank you.
Fecundity, the F word of the day. Okay, so you try to get a letter of marque and reprisal at one point. You also present your constitutional amendment, and you actually get a meeting with a U.S. senator. Which I will say was a real surprise for me. Like, I'm not saying this is like a page turner in a thriller sense, but I did not see that one coming.
I'm delighted. Yes, it happens that my second cousin works for Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. So nepotism is not a very founding father value. They were very
John Quincy
worried.
Adams.
Well, he's the exception, and I happen to like him. I think he was a great president. But so anyway, I feel bad about that. But yeah, it was fascinating. I got to meet with the senator, and I was all in. So I had my tricorn and my stockings, and he still met with me. He didn't kick me out. And I presented my petition, which again was admittedly an absurd idea, but with hopefully a deeper, serious point, because the petition was, and that's our First Amendment right, of course, is to petition the government. I believe that the president, both Democrat and Republican, current presidential office is way too powerful, and that the founders would have been shocked. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Well, I am delighted to hear that. I figured that you were on that side. But yes, I mean, that you look at, they wanted Congress. Congress was first among equals. It's the longest article in the Constitution. It's the first. George Washington had 8 executive orders in his 8 years. Barack Obama and Trump both had over 200 in their candidacy presidency. So, and what I loved is in the Constitutional Convention, and this was one of my favorite parts of the book, reading about how this document was formed and how fluid the ideas were, and how it could have gone 100 different ways. So when James Wilson first brought up the idea of a single president, several of the delegates said, "Are you jesting? That's a terrible idea. We just fought." They didn't say that in those words, but they said, "We just
Are you
fought."
effing jesting?
They would be fined. They would be in trouble. But they said, "We just fought a war to get rid of a monarch." Several wanted a council of presidents, 3 presidents, 12 presidents was brought up. And of course they lost. It was a long fight, though, weeks-long fight. And but one of them said, having a single president, that's the fetus of monarchy. The fetus of monarchy. It's just going to grow and grow in power. And that turned out to be, I think, a pretty accurate assessment. The fetus of monarchy, it's not a fetus anymore. It's a toddler, maybe a teenager, and it just seems to get stronger and stronger. So my petition was, what if we went back and thought about 3 presidents? And Ron Wyden said, that's not going to work. But he did say, yes, we have to restrain the president. There are ways of doing it. Trade should go back to Congress. War powers should go back to Congress. And so I was able to not get kicked out and have an actual conversation with him.
Well, so my question is, do constitutional arguments really pop when they're written in quill pen on parchment?
Well, I will tell you this, and in all seriousness, I wrote a lot of the book with a quill pen, and I would make my own, and there is something quite lovely about writing with a quill, or more precisely, writing offline. I don't think we all have to go back to a quill, but writing and thinking and talking offline, there's something, it changed the way I thought. I didn't have these dings and chimes and baldness cure ads popping up all the time. And I feel that it made my thinking, I hope, knock on wood, a little bit more subtle, a little bit more profound. And I think that when you read the writings of our founders, a lot of if they had to write that on an iPhone, if they had to, or do the Constitution on a Google Doc, I mean, I don't know, we wouldn't have a country.
For the record, AJ has a full head of hair, glorious hair. He needs
That's because
no
I click on the ads and get all of the potions.
So I feel like, not to dwell on this, but the quill thing is a hard no for me, because I think I have some sort of, I'm sure someone will tell me what this is called, but like a texture sound sensitivity to like that feeling of like literally saying it's making me cringe. I can sense it while I'm talking about it, and the scratching feeling is giving me the tingles.
Well, that is funny, because my wife is on your side. She hated the sound. She banished me to another room to write. And it's funny because there are ASMR videos on YouTube of people writing with a quill. And so some people like that little tingly, unpleasant feeling. I guess you don't, but it definitely, I happen to think it made me think something was happening. I'm like, I hear a sound, I'm actually accomplishing something.
So I'm just going to keep doing this, which is tell us a story. And one of them is the letters of marque and reprisal. So tell the people what letters of marque and reprisal are.
We don't do a lot of that on our podcast
because
doesn't come up a ton.
It has not. Although we did have a little bit of a piracy discussion in connection with the Houthis.
We did.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, because there's sort of a freestanding authorization for use of force against pirates.
Right.
But anyway, letters of marque and reprisal, please.
Well, I'm honored to fill that pirate-shaped hole in this show. And one thing I love, just a general note about the Constitution, is there are some parts like the preamble that are so gorgeous and resonate so much, the blessings of liberty, general welfare. And then there are parts you get to where they talk about government-sanctioned piracy. And you're like, well, this is not something, this is written in another century, because it was. And in Article 1, Section 8, Congress has the power to give private citizens basically a certificate for legalized piracy. It was called privateering. That's the more polite term. But the idea was that we did not have a navy at our country's founding, or not much of one. So when we, during the Revolutionary War, we gave out hundreds of these marks of letters of marque and reprisal, where people could take their whaling boat or their fishing boat and put some muskets on it, a cannon, go out and capture British ships and keep the booty for themselves. So it was like outsourcing. It was sort of like, Blackwater maybe. And we would not have won the war we would not have a country without privateers, because they caught 2,000 British ships. They caught supplies and food and sherry, a lot of booze. So this has not been a huge issue in recent years. There hasn't been a letter of marque issued since 1815. But I thought, I'm living the Constitution. Let me try to be the first to get a letter of marque and reprisal in 2024. And I got a meeting with a congressman, Ro Khanna from California.
Love it.
And I had written out that I am requesting, my friend was going to lend me his water ski boat, and I was going to go out there. And I presented him, I said, Congressman, I want a letter of marque and reprisal. His first reaction was, how can we make this happen? He was very optimistic. Then he's like, wait, what is this? And then I explained to him what it was. And then he was a little more, he's like, well, now that might be a little complicated. But so he was a little less enthusiastic when he found out it was about piracy. But he did bring it up. He said he liked the thesis, or the idea of my book, Exploring the Constitution. He went to Yale Law School, so he's interested in these issues. So he said he brought it up with his fellow congressional members. I'm still waiting for the green light. His assistant does email me. He calls me Captain Jacobs, so that's the closest I've gotten.
That's something.
That's something. Very little.
But it raises this fascinating, like in theory, of course it's not going to happen, but in theory, if Congress is kind of ticked that the president's not, aggressive enough against a foreign adversary, grant some billionaire some letters of marque, and they can go to it with a little private militia.
We don't need a space force. Maybe letters of marque and reprisal could be used in space, and Elon Musk can be the space force.
Absolutely.
That is good. Well, it is funny because Rand Paul did bring it up a few years ago as a possible solution against piracy off the coast of Africa. So it is sort of it's a libertarian solution to it's a very libertarian
quite libertarian. Because as I recall, the privateers could take a share of the booty. That's
the whole point.
Not at all.
That's the incentive.
100%. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Know that. And people made, And it's interesting because they are not seen as heroes because it's this, their patriotism is questioned. Was it really the profit motive? But I say people are complicated. They were patriots and they were capitalists. So I think they do not get the due that they deserve.
We will give them due on this podcast.
Yes.
Delightful.
Okay, so
John Harding. Thank you, John.
We have gotten several requests of late. In the past week or so, there has come to light an issue with where was it, David? Basically, the Secret Service came upon a crap. Hold on 1 second. Let me just get this right before I. Is it a bank? Secret Service. Let's just type Secret Service Third Amendment. That might get it.
Oh, wait. I did read something about this,
right?
But now it's forgot. I forgot. So
here we go.
Okay, good.
Here we go. Okay. So we need to talk about the Third Amendment because, again, like letters of marque and reprisal, it has come up on this podcast, but not to the extent that, frankly, I think a lot of our listeners would like. I think they tune in weekly just hoping today is the day. And we have gotten many requests of late to talk about a situation that made it into the news. I'll read from one of the stories. A Massachusetts salon owner feels violated after the U.S. Secret Service broke into her business during a nearby fundraiser for Vice President Kamala Harris. Footage from a Ring security camera shows an agent approaching the front door of the business in Berkshire, Massachusetts, before coming back to tape over the video camera. They picked the lock and then allowed multiple people to use the bathroom inside over a 2-hour period. So, the question that we've gotten with everyone sending me this news story is, can she sue under 1983, arguing that they violated her Third Amendment rights? This is federal law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe we can all opine on this thought, but you have done the really on-the-ground research on the Third Amendment that, frankly, we have not. So, first of all, tell us your Third Amendment experience. Although, as you go through that, I was disappointed that you didn't go all the way, did you?
Oh, because he didn't board with me for the whole...
Nope.
Oh, I didn't kick him out. Oh, yes. Great point, Sarah. Great point.
Yeah.
He offered, and you didn't take him up on it. He said you could kick him out.
I know. I'm too gentle. I am not. Well, the Third Amendment, as your listeners know, says that you do not have to board your quarter a soldier without your consent. And that was a big deal, obviously. Number 3 wasn't because it was one of the major gripes in the Declaration of Independence, because the British would just turn these colonists' houses into to Airbnbs without their consent. And I thought, well, this is fascinating. We've got to explore this. It's number 3. And the way I thought I could explore it is, you don't have to quarter a soldier, but if you give consent, then yes, that is also your constitutional right to put a soldier up. So I thought, all right, that's how I can do it. And I can always kick that soldier out if they act up. So I, first of all, had a lot of trouble finding a soldier who wanted to quarter. I went to Times Square during Fleet Week and asked a bunch of sailors to come to my apartment, and they were not convinced. I finally found a friend of a friend who is in the military, and my wife let him quarter for 3 days. I would have let him stay for longer, but he was lovely. And as I was mentioning to David before the show, I loved having this conversation with him because when he quartered, we had dinner, an 18th century dinner, of course, and we talked about such issues as the civilian-military divide. Because I live on the Upper West Side of New York in this complete bubble, and I don't know very many military people, and that is a problem. I think that you see that civilians and military are drifting apart. There's a big divide. So I loved quartering a soldier. And yes, as Sarah said, I kind of wimped out. I was going to kick him out at 2 a.m. to show that I'm an American and I can do that. But he was so nice. That would have been just
rude.
Yeah, it was. It was definitely rude, but maybe my right.
David, perhaps we can take a brief detour here. So just to read the text, we're textualists here on this podcast. No soldier shall, in time of peace, be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. Do you think that the salon owner has a Third Amendment claim? And I'm going to do some issue spotting here. Quartered and house.
And soldier.
And soldier.
And soldier.
So you're saying, Sarah, from a textualist standpoint, it does not hold up because it was a salon and not a house, and it was the Secret Service, not soldiers.
And I think it was too de minimis. I think coming in to use the bathroom is not quartering. My point is, I think it was trespass. Like, I think you've got him on trespass. I don't even think that's a close call. Third Amendment violation. I don't really think you're close, actually. I think you've got too many problems here.
Interesting.
But I do think the fact that it was a commercial, presuming this is a commercial zoning and all, it's totally just a business. There's absolutely nothing residential about it. I actually think that's pretty interesting that it says in any house, because obviously they had businesses then. And it does not seem to include commercial property in the Third Amendment. So right off the bat, I think I'd toss it on that before I even got to the sort of de minimis aspect versus quartering, which implies a lengthier amount of time, and even the soldier aspect, because the Third Amendment cases that do exist, and there's none at the Supreme Court, obviously, do contemplate federal law enforcement potentially being included. But you don't even need to get to that. House. It's not a house.
Right. Fascinating. I mean,
David, what do you think?
Yeah, David.
Oh, so many things. It's not a house.
It's an important issue.
It's not a soldier. And dumping is not quartering. I mean, it's a...
dumping? You mean literally taking a dump, you're saying, is not quartering?
It's a dumping ground is not a residence. So, unless you're going to a public restroom, that's nobody would call that a residence, and nobody. So it's not quartering, it's not a house, and it's not a soldier, but it is a trespass. No question about it. Yeah.
But also a de minimis damages there. You get the value of your lock if they hurt the lock, but if they just picked it.
Haven't seen the condition of the porcelain, so. So I'm withholding judgment there on the damages, Sarah.
AJ, what do you think? Have we made a compelling case to you?
Well, I think yes. I would probably have a hard time getting heard in court, but I will say, it brings up issues that I wrestled with throughout the year, which is how elastic should these words be? And so you get something like freedom of the press. I mean, we don't have a literal press anymore. Newspapers are not put in a press. But we have freedom of, pressing return and going on your Substack. So does that count, even though it's not literally the press? So you have other issues like the Fourth Amendment, reasonable cause, and do they talk about personal effects? So does data, is that an actual effect or not? So these are all issues that I love wrestling with, and I don't have a great answer. But overall, on the most important issue, I agree with Sarah and David. She should not take this to the Supreme Court.
What did you change your mind about most? Because you went into this, clearly, you didn't go into this with all of your constitutional mind made up by far. You love the United States. You're a patriot. That was all very clear heading into this project. But you're politically on the left. I don't know if you're legally on the left or right, what you'd consider yourself going into this book, but you wrote some really interesting, nuanced things that at times you say cut against your politics sometimes, at other times it didn't, or your friends or your community. I mean, what's fun about this book is you write it as almost a diary as you're wrestling and learning. So Here, now, some many months after the book has been published, what has stuck? What did you change your mind on? What are you grappling with now? I don't know. How are you doing, AJ?
Well, thank you for asking. Like my shrink. I would say, well, first of all, the meta point is I feel I changed my mind about changing my mind. I was really impressed with the epistemic humility of our founders. And during the convention, for instance, Ben Franklin said, the older I get, the less certain I am of my own opinions, which I love. And I don't think you see that kind of humility today in politics. He told a story, which I love. At the convention, he said, there was this French lady who said to her sister, "It's so strange. Why am I the only person I've ever met who is correct on every single issue?" And his point was, we're all the French lady. We all think we're right on everything, and we're not. So first of all, that's the meta point, is be a little more open to changing your mind, and not willy-nilly, not because you think it'll appeal to the electorate, but because you look at the pros and cons and the evidence and have a cold take, not a hot take. So that is the meta point. One that I thought was fascinating was I went into it very skeptical of states as a states' rights, because during the convention, Alexander Hamilton gave a speech where he said, why do we have states? It's such a, people can't serve two different masters. Let's just get rid of the states, essentially. He later said he was kidding because he got a lot of flack. But
JK.
Yeah.
Especially at that time.
Take it back. But I'd always had that sort of feeling. What are the advantages of states, when I saw them as sort of impediments to progress? They often would be against civil rights legislation, etc. But after talking to all these scholars and reading, I do see, I love the idea they could be laboratories of democracy, where you try out a policy, and if it works, then it can spread. I don't think that's happening very much, because I think that it's more of a top-down system now. But I would like to see more. The states have a more sort of free-flowing, experimental mindset when it comes to legislation. So that was a big change for me. And just the whole idea of how we should balance our government was fascinating to me, because I definitely came to your side. I should have been there earlier, but that the president is too powerful. I think the Supreme Court is too powerful. I think that Congress should go back to first among equals. I think that's what the founders didn't get everything right. They were racist, they were sexist. It wasn't perfect, but they did have some ideas that we should rediscover, like Congress being leading the train.
Okay. Oh yeah, David, you go, and then I'll do last question.
Yeah. So I, just in walking through it, what was the most enjoyable aspect of this? I think probably stoning, or first being stoned and then stoning, probably is not in the list. Depending on how the soldier was, quartering could have been a lot of fun.
Right.
The letters of marque, I'm just sad you didn't get it, because I would have loved to see you mount on a ski boat with your musket and you tried to accomplish some privateering. That would have been amusing. But what was the most enjoyable aspect of it?
That's a great question. Well, first of all, if I ever get it, I am calling you up and seeing if you will come on the boat with me.
Oh, you don't even have to ask. You'd have to eject me from the boat. Okay.
All right. We are forming a militia, a well-regulated militia right here. Well, one of my favorite parts was the right to assemble is in the First Amendment. And I expressed that by having an 18th century style dinner party where I invited people from all over the political spectrum. So I had progressives, liberals, libertarians, conservatives, and about 15 people. And I made my son cook us an 18th century beef stew, which has a lot of cloves. They love their cloves. And we had a discussion about what we liked about the Constitution, what we liked about America, what we would want to change. And of course, we had very differing opinions, but one thing we did agree on is that we should do more of this, that we need more face-to-face discussions where people can civilly agree to disagree, but almost treating it like a puzzle, a cooperative puzzle, instead of a war. Because when I disagree with someone, my default mode is to go into like, here's why you're wrong, here's my evidence. That rarely accomplishes anything. So instead, trying to solve the puzzle, what do we disagree on? Why do we disagree? Why do I believe what I believe? Why does she believe what she believes? What can we do, even if we do disagree? What policies could we go that we do agree on, and where can we go from here? So I love that. And that is a very founding father idea. I mean, Ben Franklin had the Junto, which was the philosophy club that met and talked about social issues. So that's something that I think we should recapture. And I loved it. So that was very enjoyable.
You have 2 children. The book is, in fact, dedicated to them, along with wait, do you have 3 children?
I do have 3 children.
Sorry. Let me. All of a sudden, I was like, wait, I think there's a third. Wait a second. You have 3 children. In fact, the book is dedicated to them, along with your wife, all boys. And I'm just wondering how they have recovered from the incredible amounts of teenage shame that you must have brought upon them as you walked around publicly, and in many cases, bringing them with you to do such things. Like I can see it going either way. Like your kids, like, you know what? If dad wants to be absurd, like, that's cool. That's his beat. You know, it does pay for the food on our table. Like, that would be a really healthy attitude. But I could really see another teenager, especially a younger teenager, just being mortified to an extent that, like, they'll be talking to this about their therapist in a few years.
I have both. It's split. Because yes, I all dads are embarrassing, but I do take it to a different level, and I apologize to my kids. But for instance, I was trying to only use quills instead. So when I went to a restaurant, Chinese restaurant, I would bring my quill and ink and sign the bill, and they would just slink out and be like, oh, they wouldn't walk within 50 yards of me. That was 2 of them. But one of them, and he's 20 now, so maybe he's a little less embarrassed, but his favorite comedian is a guy named Eric Andre, who is sort of a performance art comedian who does weird things. He's sort of like Charlie Kaufman. And so he saw me as a very mild, less courageous version of Eric Andre. And he actually came out with me. He would put on the tricorn and he would come with me to ask soldiers to quarter. And so, yes, one of my sons was supportive, which was the first in my life, because I've done several of these books. And this is the first time anyone in my family was like, hey, I'll join you. So that was a pleasant surprise.
If you ever need somebody to don the tricorn, the wig, the breeches,
David just wants the wig because David doesn't have any hair.
Get one of the flintlocks. Get one of my flintlocks off the mantle. You know, then hey, just call me.
This is huge and exciting. All right, you are going to be recruited.
Look, I mean, next book idea. I've got a replica 1840s handgun. What are we calling those, David? You know, the kind that's in the guest bedroom that you've stayed in from Texas independence, the war for Texas independence.
Yeah.
So if you want to do the next one,
it's a flintlock pistol.
Yeah, it is. It is a flintlock pistol.
Wow.
It's a replica, but still, I feel like if I brandished it around, it would have some intended effect. So if you want to do Texas in 1836, like, I'm so there.
This is great news. All right, I have my next book project. Thank you. Thank you both.
AJ Jacobs, The Year of Living Constitutionally. This is just a fun book. It's a diary of a nerd exploring a new area of nerddom, and there's nothing I love more than that. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for writing this. And thank you for proving once again, as has been a theme this month, David, that I should really stop judging books by their cover, because this is the second book that I thought was going to really suck that we were doing that proved to not suck at all. So,
I'm just waiting for the guest where you say, this is a book that I thought would suck, and it did. and then go from there.
Thank you, AJ.
Thank you.